There is a loneliness so deep it doesn't sound like silence. It echoes like performance. You walk into a room and smile, laugh, gesture, nod. People see a version of you, polished, agreeable, well-adjusted. But the real you? The one under the practiced expressions and socially correct replies? That one stands in the shadows, watching like a ghost. You are there, and yet you are not. And what no one sees is how exhausting it is to be constantly admired for someone you're not. In the theater of life, every child is handed a mask. Some are bright and charming, others reserved and intellectual. The mask depends on what earns affection, what silences punishment, what grants acceptance. Over time, the child forgets where the mask ends and the skin begins. And so, the boy who was once curious and angry becomes the good son. The girl who dared to say no learns to always smile. And what begins as a choice calcifies into identity. But here's the fracture. The more perfectly you perform, the less you are seen. And the more praise you receive for being agreeable, the more it hurts to admit, none of this feels like you. Beneath the applause is a quiet terror. If they ever knew who I really was, would they still want me? Carl Jung called it the persona, the social mask we wear to survive the gaze of others. It is not evil. It protects. It gets you the job, the friends, the approval. But it comes at a cost. The longer you wear the persona, the harder it is to take off. And eventually, you forget whether there was ever a self beneath it at all. This is why the mirror unsettles you at night. Not because you look bad, but because you don't look true. It's why compliments don't stick. Why success feels hollow. Why even surrounded by people who love you, you still feel utterly alone. Because love that is earned through performance never touches the soul. Somewhere deep in your psyche, there is a locked room, the one you never let anyone in. And within it lives the stranger. The version of you that still remembers what you wanted before the world told you who to be. The version of you that felt anger, desire, fear, not the filtered, approved versions, but raw, alive, inconvenient emotions. The version you buried, thinking it was the only way to be loved. And yet, this stranger is not your enemy. They are your salvation. Because the longer you deny this hidden self, the more fragmented you become. The more you chase admiration, the more empty you feel. The more you please, the more you disappear. The world praises your mask, but it is your silence they are clapping for. So now you wonder why you feel like a stranger, even in your own skin. It is not because you are broken. It is because you are too good at pretending to be whole. But here's a truth most never say out loud. The mask will never be enough. And the real self will never be truly silent. It will haunt your relationships, sabotage your goals, whisper doubts as you fall asleep. Because the soul does not disappear, it waits. It waits for the day you are brave enough to stop performing and start remembering. And when that day comes, it will feel like dying. Because to remove the persona is not simply to unmask, it is to unravel. Every belief, every habit, every friendship you built while wearing it might no longer fit. You may find that your job doesn't align with your values, that your partner only loves the version of you that never says no, that your dream life was never really yours. But there is something sacred about this collapse, because only through the breaking do you begin to rebuild. It begins quietly, not with rage, but with grief. The kind of grief that doesn't come from losing someone, but from realizing how long you've lived without yourself. You start to notice how your laughter feels rehearsed, how your tone adjusts based on who's in the room. You catch yourself mid-sentence, saying things you don't fully believe, simply because they're expected. And in those moments, a sharp ache rises in your chest, not because you're failing, but because you've succeeded too well at being what others wanted. The pain of persona is not theatrical, it is mundane. It's in the text you send with a smile emoji when you're actually breaking. It's in the compliment you give to avoid confrontation. It's in the way you say, "I'm fine," so fluently that even you start believing it. The greatest danger isn't that others are fooled, it's that you are. But beneath that ache, something ancient stirs. A voice long buried begins to whisper, "You don't have to do this anymore." And suddenly, the choice that never felt like a choice starts unraveling. What if you stopped smiling when you didn't feel like it? What if you told the truth, even if it made others uncomfortable? What if you chose discomfort over dishonesty, not to hurt others, but to finally stop hurting yourself? The road back to yourself is not a straight line. It is a spiral. You will return to old wounds, revisit childhood memories, Question every identity you thought was fixed. It will feel like peeling layers of skin, raw, vulnerable, terrifying. But beneath each layer is something more real, more alive than anything the persona could ever offer. Carl Jung believed that the path to wholeness begins with confronting the shadow, the parts of ourselves we were told to reject. Anger, desire, ambition, sorrow. The traits that got us punished, silenced, mocked. We buried them not because they were bad, but because they were inconvenient. And in doing so, we buried our vitality along with them. But here's the paradox. What you repress controls you. The anger you ignore turns into passive aggression. The desire you deny mutates into shame. The sadness you suppress hardens into apathy. The more you run from the shadow, the more power it holds over you. Only when you turn toward it, with courage, with compassion, can it become your ally. So you begin to have a different kind of conversation with yourself. One that isn't about being better, but about being true. You let the anger speak. You let the fear tremble without silencing it. You stop gaslighting your own soul in the name of being likable. And in that radical honesty, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel whole. Not perfect, not even happy all the time, but whole. You are no longer editing yourself based on what others might approve of. You are no longer performing normalcy while dying of emotional hunger. And even though it feels unstable at first, this new way of being is the only one where peace is possible. Still, there is loss. Let's not pretend otherwise. When you take off the mask, some people will look away. Not everyone will love the unfiltered you. Some only knew how to love your silence, your servitude, your shine. But what you lose in illusion, you gain in integrity. And integrity, though quiet, is fierce. It anchors you in storms. It teaches you how to stand without applause. It rewires your worth away from being useful and toward being real. You stop asking, "Am I enough for them?" and start asking, "Are they true enough for me?" The difference is life-changing. Because as you strip away what is false, you create space for what is sacred: connection, not performance; love, not validation; purpose, not approval. And those who see you now, they're not drawn to your mask. They're drawn to the fire beneath it, the fire you almost forgot. And so, the stranger begins to vanish, not because they've disappeared, but because they've been remembered. The moment you begin to reclaim the stranger within, a strange stillness enters your life, not the numbness of suppression, but the silence that follows truth. You walk through familiar places and realize how much of your life was choreographed, how many gestures were masks, how many relationships were echoes of who you thought you had to be. The world remains loud, demanding, hungry for your persona, but now you listen differently. Because now you hear what's underneath the noise. You start to notice who speaks to your surface and who speaks to your soul. Some conversations feel like code, exchanges of polite fictions. Others feel like recognition, like being seen without needing to explain. And in those rare moments of real connection, you understand just how starved you were. Not for attention, not for praise, but for truth. For contact that isn't filtered through expectation. You begin to feel what the Stoics meant when they spoke of tranquility, not the absence of pain, but the absence of pretense. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." You take this to heart. Your words become fewer, but heavier. Your presence becomes quieter, but deeper. You're no longer desperate to be included, because you've stopped excluding yourself from your own life. This is not self-improvement. This is self-reclamation. And yet, the more honest you become, the more resistance you meet, not just from others, but from within. Because for years, your worth was measured in how much you could suppress, how agreeable you could be, how little space you could take up. Even when freedom begins to bloom inside you, a voice still whispers, "Be careful. Don't be too much. Don't disappoint them." But you see that voice now for what it is, not truth, but trauma. A ghost from the years you were punished for authenticity. A reflex from when safety meant silence. And instead of obeying it, you offer it compassion. You say, "Thank you for protecting me. But I'm not that scared child anymore. I'm not that lonely teenager. I'm not that exhausted adult who thought love had to be earned through sacrifice." And just like that, the spell begins to break. You start setting boundaries, not out of anger, but out of alignment. You stop over-explaining yourself. You let people misunderstand you, because you realize your job is not to be decoded, it's to be embodied. And those who resonate will find you. They always do. You stop bending to avoid conflict. You stop shrinking to fit small rooms. You start taking up the space your soul was designed for. And what you find in that space is not arrogance, but peace. Peace because you no longer need to prove anything. Peace because you are no longer negotiating with your own reflection. Peace because being misunderstood no longer threatens your identity. You're not here to be liked by everyone. You're here to be true, even if that truth is inconvenient, unsettling, or slow to be accepted. You once thought freedom looked like applause. Now you see it looks like solitude, the kind where you are alone but not lonely, because you're no longer abandoning yourself to belong. You once chased admiration. Now you chase alignment. You once feared silence. Now it feels like home. The world doesn't reward this easily. It prefers you polished, predictable, palatable. But every so often, you meet someone who's also taken off their mask. And when your eyes meet, it's like recognizing yourself in a mirror you didn't know existed. No performance, no agenda, just two souls, naked and unafraid. And in that moment, you understand what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not to be loved by everyone, not to be perfect, but to finally belong not to the crowd, but to yourself." But even in this newfound truth, there will be days when the old self calls to you, not with words, but with familiar cravings, the urge to be liked, the temptation to play small, the reflex to conform when eyes are watching. The persona does not die with revelation, it fades with discipline. It returns, especially when you're tired, scared, or lonely. When you feel vulnerable and the mask once promised safety, you might catch yourself smiling when you're in pain. You might censor your truth mid-sentence. You might nod when your soul wants to scream. These are not failures. They are echoes. Echoes of a self you outgrew, but once needed to survive. So you pause. You breathe. You do not shame the old reflex. You thank it, then choose again. This is the real work, not the dramatic breaking, but the quiet rebuilding. The slow, deliberate return to yourself every single day. Choosing honesty over approval, stillness over noise, depth over charm. It's not glamorous. Sometimes it's lonely, but it is real. And after living in mirrors and masks for so long, real is the most sacred thing you can touch. And with time, people begin to notice. Not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. You speak less, and yet your words cut deeper. You no longer fill silence with empty chatter, and somehow, that silence becomes magnetic. Some people will say you've changed. Others will say you've finally arrived. But the truth is, you've simply stopped hiding. Your presence becomes a mirror. It reflects who others are pretending to be. Some will run from it. Others will be drawn in, not because you make them comfortable, but because you remind them of something they buried, too. The truth always does. This is when the guilt may creep in, the guilt of disappointing expectations, of no longer being who they wanted you to be. But guilt is not always a sign of wrongdoing. Sometimes, it is simply the price of growth. When you stop betraying yourself to make others comfortable, you will feel guilt. That's not a mistake. That's a sign you're leaving the cage. And what waits outside that cage is not chaos, but clarity. You begin to trust your own voice again. Not the voice that knows what to say, but the one that knows what is true. You begin to feel emotions fully, without fear they'll consume you. Anger becomes a compass, not a sin. Sadness becomes sacred. Even joy, the most vulnerable emotion of all, becomes something you allow without needing to earn it. You stop performing resilience and start embodying it. Not because you never fall, but because you no longer fake being okay when you're not. You stop numbing your intuition. You start following it. You no longer search for mirrors in other people's eyes. You found your reflection in your own. And now, something beautiful happens. You no longer chase love like a currency. You become it. You no longer ask, will they accept me? You ask, do I accept myself? The longing to be everything for everyone dissolves. In its place grows a fierce devotion to being who you are, even if it's messy, imperfect, too loud, too quiet, too much, not enough. You no longer try to be interesting. You become interested. In life, in meaning, in depth. The game of pretending to be someone wears thin. The freedom of being someone real becomes irresistible. And eventually, the mask begins to gather dust, not because you never wear it, but because you no longer need it. There is a soft kind of power in this, not dominance, not charisma, but presence. You show up. You are whole. You speak, not to impress, but to reveal. You walk, not to be seen, but because the ground finally feels like home. You are not a stranger in your own skin anymore. You are what you were before the world told you to be something else. And when you stop trying to be loved for who you're not, that's when they start loving you for who you are.